Well, hello, it's Bruce Williams again, and we're still sheltering in place in Bethesda, Maryland. So I think it's time for another Gross Path Challenge. This one is going to be number 62. I hope you're enjoying these as much as I'm enjoying looking at some of these old pictures again. Slide number 1 is one of my favorite pictures of all time. It is tissue from an ox. Can you give me a morphologic diagnosis and a cause? Okay, time's up. Beautiful sagittal cross-section of the skull of an ox. There is marked expansion of the maxilla and the nasal bone. Morphologic diagnosis are going to be multifocal to coalescing. Granulomatous, nasal and maxillary osteomyelitis. Here are the large areas of granulomatous inflammation. There's tremendous amounts of remodeling and proliferative new bone of these two bones here. The cause of this condition is Actinomyces bovis. The name of the condition is lumpy jaw. We usually see it in most of the pictures are taken of inflammation in the mandibles, but this is a great one that shows that you can see it in other bones. You can also see this in the lymph nodes of the face and the superficial cervical lymph nodes as well. They get into the drainage here. You just get this tremendous inflammation and bony deformation of the skull. Okay? Lumpy jaw, Actinomyces bovis. Slide number 2 is tissue from a cat. Can you give me a morphologic diagnosis and a cause? Okay, time's up. Another beautiful picture. This one is very up close and personal. If you didn't get this one, don't feel too bad. But having seen this a number of times, it's a great representation of the lungs of a cat who has been infected with Leurostrongylus abstrusus, or the cat lungworm. Okay, what we're looking at here, this sort of pink frosty area is normal aerated lungs, and this area here that looks smoother and a deeper pink are areas of lobular collapse. Remember, Leurostrongylus abstrusus basically lives in the alveoli of the lungs. You see the adult worms, you see the larvae, you see the eggs, all in one big happy family down in the alveoli. So you have alveolar collapse. And this is a really nice representation of what those lungs would look. There are a lot of cats out there that have subclinical infections, especially feral cats. And usually you don't get into trouble until you have some sort of superimposed infection, whether it is FIP, herpes viral infection or something. But you can find this in feral cats on a not uncommon basis in some parts of this country. Leurostrongylus abstrusus, and it's just this beautiful, this almost looks like frosting to me on top of these lungs. So Leurostrongylus abstrusus, the cat lungworm. Slide number 3 is tissue from a horse. Can you give me 2 morphologic diagnoses? Okay, time's up. Our first morphologic diagnosis here is a large bile duct. Remember that horses don't have gallbladders, but they can still form stones. Okay, you get calcium carbonate, calcium stearate type stones. The steroids tend to be the ones that look really dark. And if you ever, when you were a kid, ate something that we called sugar babies, they're little caramels, and they're small, they were round, and that's sort of what these remind me. And a lot of young residents, when they first see gallstones, they miss them because they're expecting something hard and white, like you would see like struvite stones in the bladder, and they're not. They're often very mushy, and they're sort of a dark brown. And then there is a second type where you do have a higher amount of mineral in them. They tend to be whiter. It looks like this particular animal was producing both of them. Now, horses don't have gallbladders, but they still make stones, and they can get into the biliary system. Oops. Preview the next slide. Into the biliary system. They will block up the ducts, and that's exactly what's happened here. Our second morphologic diagnosis is diffuse hepatic fibrosis with hepatocellular loss. And in parentheses, I'm going to put cirrhosis. I don't like cirrhosis, particularly for a morphologic diagnosis. Cirrhosis looks very different between, for example, dogs, which tend to get a lot of macronodular regeneration, and horses or cattle, in which you get a lot of fibrosis, which encroaches on the lobule, and the liver, instead of being big and bumpy, just gets smaller and harder and whiter. If you look at this, you can see there is extensive fibrosis, which outlines the portal areas because we have post-hepatic obstruction here. So this is all fibrosis due to the obstruction of this large bile duct, and then you have a tremendous loss. Remember that post-hepatic obstruction is a major cause of cirrhosis of the liver, especially in the horse. I would imagine that this animal's gamma GT values, GGT, would be totally through the roof. That is a marker for cholestasis in horses. The liver itself looks a little greenish to me, like you have retention of bile. I bet this animal was a little bit yellow clinically. So remember, you can get choledochitis due to formation of bile stones in the horse. Tissue from a chicken is slide number 4. Can you give me a morphologic diagnosis and a cause? Okay, time's up. We're looking at the trachea of a chicken. There is a large fibrin cast in it. My first choice is going to be always infectious laryngotracheitis in a bird, in a chicken, and that is caused by an alpha herpes virus, avian herpes virus type 1, cause of infectious laryngotracheitis. You have necrosis of the tracheal epithelium. You will have slough, exudation. If you look at the sloughed plug histologically, that is where you often will see multinucleated cells and cells with intranuclear inclusions. And sometimes you'll see multinucleated viral syncytia with multiple nuclei containing these viral inclusions. There are some other possibilities. I guess that pox virus or wet pox can form plugs at this point in the trachea. I'd like a better look at the tracheal lumen to see if it's red. But when I see a chicken, first thing I'm going to think about is infectious laryngotracheitis. Now, this is a severe case. There is lots of ILT out there, and most cases show very mild clinical signs. Okay, the animal may cough a little bit because this is something that circulates in flocks all the time. People always, it's one of the things that if you see coughing or snicking or a little bit of blood when the animal coughs, then they automatically reach for vaccine. You have some vaccine-induced cases, and most of the cases that we see are actually very mild. They're probably related to vaccination rather than the true street virus. When you see true street virus, it's an ugly lesion. The animals, they cough and blood goes on their feathers, and it's an ugly thing. But there's a lot of this out there, and doing PCR and getting a hit for infectious laryngotracheitis, is not the end of the world. Okay, slide number 5 is tissue from a mouse. What a classic disease. It's a great picture, and I would like for you to name this condition and give me the cause. Okay, time's up on this one. This is a classic one, and remember, it is not just the tail, but we see these annular constrictions, the swelling of the tail. You can have necrosis, it could slough, and it also often affects the feet as well. We have one relatively normal foot and one sort of swollen foot. The name of the condition is ringtail. Been around a long time, long before people got creative with names, and they said, it's got rings on its tail. It's called ringtail. And traditionally, this has been considered, the cause has been low humidity, low temperature environments. And that's been around since the 70s. Low temperature, low humidity. When I was a resident, low temperature, low humidity. Within the last 10 years or so, there have been at least one good paper, maybe more, which have identified this as a very local cornification defect. And cornification defects affect the epithelium. The epithelium doesn't come apart very well. And what happens is you have these cornification defects, so this skin is not sloughed, and it acts as an annular band and dries out and constricts that tail. I think it's a good paper. I think that for those of you taking certification exams, you probably need to know that, as well as knowing that classically this has been considered low temperature, low humidity. So, ringtail in the mouse. Tissue from a horse. Can you give me a morphologic diagnosis and a cause? Okay, it's a great picture. This is a fixed lesion. We're looking at the cranial mesenteric artery of a horse, which is a classic site for the temporary home of the stage 4 and 5 larvae, not adults, but the larvae of Strongylus vulgaris. The adults will live in the lumen of the large intestine. They're big red hematophagous worms, but the larvae are the one that causes this particular lesion. When the eggs hatch out in the intestine and the immature forms of the larva burrow through the wall of the intestine, they go on a bit of a walkabout, and they burrow up through the adventitia, and then the intima, progress through the wall into the intima of the arteries of the abdomen. They generally end up in the cranial mesenteric artery. They don't like to turn. So they come out of the intestine, they go up, and before they hit the distal aorta, they tend to aggregate here. Very few of them like to make lateral turns, believe it or not. People have, spent time looking at this random walk model. But some do go the wrong way. You can also see lesions in the renal arteries, maybe in the splenic arteries, the caudal-pudendal artery, and occasionally, some that are especially adventurous will walk up the adventitia, the intima of the aorta all the way, and they make a curve, and they go down and they get caught above the valves of the aorta in a supravalvular location, and they form a large granuloma. Now, there are a couple things that are going on here. You can have small intimal streaks in a lot of vessels, but where they come to roost, they do a lot of damage. They strip the endothelium. You have thrombosis. You have granulomatous inflammation. You have some eosinophils, because they are nematode parasites as well. And you get the formation due to a weakening of the wall of this vessel, as well as turbulent flow and thrombosis. You get the formation of a pseudo aneurysm. An aneurysm, true aneurysm, is a thinning of the wall because you get fibrosis, you get smooth muscle hyperplasia and disarray, and all this inflammation. You get a thickening of the wall, so it's truly a pseudo aneurysm. Your morphologic diagnosis for this should be something you have practiced and you're ready to go, because this is one you don't want to figure out on the fly. I took my test many, many years ago, said, look, if I see this lesion, I am going to call it a focally extensive, granulomatous, and proliferative craniomesenteric arteritis with pseudo aneurysm formation. And the proliferation covers the proliferation of fibrous connective tissue, fibroblasts, smooth muscle, and all of the inflammatory cells outside of the granulomatous inflammation. So, one more time, this is a proliferative and granulomatous craniomesenteric arteritis with pseudoaneurysm formation. If you look real closely in the vessels down here, maybe some of these vessels, you'll see tiny little raised tracts underneath the endothelium, which are previous sites of migration of the larva, but they didn't form this classic lesion, which unfortunately we don't see too much because most of the horses now are on good worming programs. You can still see this in some horses that have been neglected. You can see this in some wild equids, but it's not a very common lesion anymore. And yesterday I showed you the beautiful arterial infarcts that often accompany these lesions. And the infarctions were in various parts of the gut. It used to be a very common cause of colic in horses. Slide number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 is tissue from a cat. Can you give me a morphologic diagnosis? Okay, a couple lectures back I showed you a variant of the eosinophilic granuloma complex, which is known as the linear plaque, which is sort of an ulcerated area in the on the back of the hind leg, so the thigh, plantar aspect of the thigh in a cat. I said there are two other types. You have the indolent ulcers in the mouth, and then you get the eosinophilic granuloma. Two of the three, indolent ulcers and linear plaque, you often get late in the stage of development, and there aren't many eosinophils. This one is called the eosinophilic granuloma. These are great looking ones. They're big, they're raw, they're red, they're weepy, they're angry looking. They don't have a particular distribution. So you can see them on the trunk, on the side, on the legs. But the one thing that they do have is eosinophils. They have eosinophils and they have a lot of granulomatous inflammation around that. They are the prototypical eosinophilic granuloma. So when you biopsy these, you're always going to see a lot of eosinophils. So it makes for a pretty easy biopsy. You don't have a whole lot of differentials. And this is pretty much what they look like. They do respond, in my experience as a veterinarian, to some dietary manipulation, a little bit of corticosteroids in the very initial phase. And this is something the animal's probably going to have on and off the rest of its life. But great picture of an eosinophilic granuloma. And if you look over here to my left, you'll see Miss Smeagol, and she is enjoying the sunshine, looking out. The reason she got up, there must have been a bird fly by on the 15th floor, but there aren't that many, and so she's going to take a bath. Okay. Slide number 6 is tissue from a calf. Can you name the condition? Okay, time's up. This one has been around for a long, long time. And this particular condition is not uncommon. It's probably very underreported because most animals don't show any clinical signs. It resolves over time. What I want you to look at are these white spots on the kidney. And this is a condition that since time immemorial has been referred to as white spotted kidney. And white spotted kidney generally arises from a subclinical bacterial infection. It could come from an infected navel and be part of navel ill. It could also come from a shower from the intestine, but it is generally considered to be the result of a mild, non-fatal gram-negative sepsis. It goes to the kidney. Initially, these white spots are areas of necrosis with a little bit of neutrophils. Over time, they go through a maturation process, and most of the time, they end up as little bits of lymphocytic or lymphoplasmacytic inflammation before they resolve. The morphologic diagnosis for this would be a chronic suppurative embolic nephritis. Embolic because it comes through the bloodstream. It explains the multifocal, somewhat miliary nature of these white spots. So chronic suppurative embolic nephritis. And I can't tell you if this one is still suppurative. It's probably looks a little less well demarcated. So I think maybe it's a lymphoplasmacytic, and this one is resolving. Probably most of the cases you see will be from veal calves or something like that, because it's got to be a very common problem, but the animals don't seem to be horribly affected by it. We have only 2 slides left. This one is tissue from a piglet. Can you give me a morphologic diagnosis and a cause for this lesion? This is a piglet. It's a young, probably weaner or piglet, or even younger, anywhere from maybe 2 weeks to 4 weeks. And we see these large areas of exudation in the epidermitis, or the epidermis. And the name of the condition is exudative epidermitis. And that's a really good name for it. This is caused by Staphylococcus, which has an exfoliative exotoxin, somewhat akin to what we see with impetigo in people. The name of the actual bacterium is Staphylococcus hyacus. Whenever you see hyacus, think about pigs, because hyacus is another name for pig. I believe it's Greek. And so what you have is you have this tremendous accumulation of neutrophils in necrotic epidermis. It's an epidermal lysin. Some people say it's related to staphylococcal scalding syndrome in people, but this toxin that is elaborated by Staph hyacus causes necrosis of the very superficial layers of the epidermis. You have infiltration of neutrophils, and the underlying dermis really has very little going on. So it is a true exudative epidermitis, and that's what I call it, the morphologic diagnosis, exudative epidermitis as well. A great case in which the name of the disease is very suitable for morphologic diagnosis. This is a young animal, probably only a couple. Don't really know exactly why. Some animals are infected, most animals are not. And it is introduced into a herd by probably a carrier pig, and then because pigs are always sort of nibbling and sucking on each other, there's breaks in the skin, which in one of these reactive pigs is enough to allow them to break with the disease. Staph hyacus is occasionally seen in other species. It is a cause of ophthalmitis in turkeys, and it is a cause of toxic shock syndrome in people. So Staph hyacus, exudative epidermitis in pigs. And our final slide for the day is tissue from a dog. Can you give me a morphologic diagnosis and a cause? Okay, time's up. We're looking at a lung. Unfortunately, the front and the back, still hard to tell because front and the back sort of been cut off. But this is a lung. Now that you know it's a lung, you can see that it has not collapsed. The fact that it has not collapsed, we're looking at the caudal lobe of the lung, suggests that this is an interstitial pneumonia rather than a broncho pneumonia. And we have some areas, a lot of areas in a sort of retiform pattern, which are collapsed, and then you have a lot which are white. It looks like something has been added. Okay, what's been added in this case? When you see a lung that is this distended in a dog, especially in the US, I want you to think about the possibility of dimorphic fungal infection. And this is what the case is. The morphologic diagnosis is going to be a diffuse interstitial granulomatous pneumonia, and a cause of, depending on where you live, I will take a number of possibilities here. I am very happy if you give me blastomyces dermatitis, histoplasma capsulatum, or coccidioides immitis. If you're on the West Coast, now it used to be the San Joaquin Valley in California, now it's extended all the way down through Texas and Mexico, so a much larger widespread area for Coccidioides immitis. There's another one, Coccidioides posidasii, or daisy posii. I never can remember. I think it's posidasii. And so there is another one there. Cryptococcus neoformans, I suppose you have to lump it in there. Why not? I haven't seen one that's this bad with Cryptococcus, but it's big. It won't collapse. And I'm going to put my dimorphic fungi first. Remember, these are not infectious diseases per se. You're not going to spread one from one dog to another. They get into a source of the sexual form or the mycelium of this, which is usually in nitrogenous waste, bird materials or whatever. They get a big sniff, and then the yeast forms get down into their lungs like that. It's not spread from animal to animal, but great. So when you see huge lungs that won't collapse in a dog, I think, in a cat, I think that you need to consider one of these dimorphic fungi. Okay, well, that brings us to the end of another Gross Pat Challenge. I hope that you're finding these to be a worthwhile time spent, maybe about 30 minutes of your day. And I hope that there's some good stuff in here that you're enjoying. I know there are at least some fantastic pictures, even if my stories about them are not always quite up to snuff. So with that, I will see you tomorrow with another Gross Pat Challenge.